in the long run, we tend to see people and kids on the spectrum actually be more anxious if they've gone through many years of people trying to reduce, minimize, or extinguish behavior without asking the why question. Why is this person doing this?
As April approaches, we are preparing for Autism Acceptance Month. This is a time for us to reflect on the experiences of autistic people and their families, and to celebrate their strengths and unique perspectives. We're starting with a visit with Barry Prizant, author of Uniquely Human and host of the Uniquely Human podcast. That's straight ahead on episode 165. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity Podcast.
We're going to present episodes about autism throughout this month. Autism is a complex and diverse condition, and during this Autism Acceptance Month, we'll be presenting conversations that I have with both autism experts and autistic people alike. Each and every autistic individual has their own unique strengths and challenges, and our goal is to create a space where autistic individuals and their families can feel seen, heard, and valued, and where we can all learn from each other. During Autism Acceptance Month, it's important to remember that acceptance means more than just awareness. It means creating a world where autistic individuals are embraced and included, where they're given the support they need to thrive, and where their differences are celebrated. I hope that through this series of episodes, we can help to contribute to this vision of a more accepting and inclusive world. Our conversation with Barry Prizant is next.
on a previous episode of the Neurodiversity Podcast.
We're saying that they're intense and they need to know and they have a drive to know and they won't stop until they figure out everything and they feel so many things. And so there was only one explanation at one point, that is overexcitabilities, posited by Kazimierz Dabrowski, a Polish psychologist in the 60s. And that was the only theory that could explain that. And that theory has very little empirical support. And so in the light of the little empirical support and the observations that so many people were making, in the sense that this is happening. So if you're telling me that this theory doesn't have a lot of support, then what explanation are you giving me for this?
That's episode 147. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
Today, I'm excited to welcome Barry Prizant, author of Uniquely Human, A Different Way of Seeing Autism, to the podcast. So, Barry, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you, Emily. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I have to start off by telling you a quick story that I think you will appreciate. So, I have a consultation group with several other neurodiversity affirming therapists. And during our meeting this month, our topic was bringing books that have influenced us in our work and our clients. And out of the 7 of us that were there that day, 3 of us planned to share about your book and about how it's such a great tool to share with families of autistic kids to really help them understand their kids better.
Yes, well, that's terrific. And that's what I was hoping to accomplish when it was first written. And that's to really reach out to parents and to reach out to a very broad range audience, because so much of my work prior to that was more academic, peer-reviewed journals, quote-unquote scholarly volumes. But it's so important to reach everybody. The
consensus that we reached in our group was it does such a great job of normalizing the experience and helping people to see autism through that different lens, a different way of seeing autism. But it truly, I think, accomplished that goal. And I feel like parents who I've shared that with, they just get so much out of it in order to then move forward with their kids. So you mentioned that you did some academic work prior to that. Tell me a little bit more about what brought you to write the book in the first place.
Well, it was basically what I just kind of said very briefly. And that is, I knew that my work was accepted, was acknowledged, was valued in academic circles. And that has to do with the research we've done on everything from echolalia to emotional regulation to so many things that are being looked at differently finally in autism. But I also knew, having worked with parents for decades and decades, I mean, we do a parent retreat weekend that we've done for 25 years now. I knew that a lot of my work was not reaching people outside of kind of the academic circles in autism and the therapy circles and the educational circles. And the other thing was that I always learned by stories, by listening to other people's stories, listening to parents' stories, listening to the stories of autistic self-advocates. And so I documented many stories for many years. And my wife, who's a psychologist, nurse, and bioethicist, but not in autism, she said to me, why don't you just write a book of your stories and make the points that you want people to take away from those stories? And I had no shortage of stories to tell. So when people say, well, what is uniquely human? What's the book like? I say it's a storybook. And hopefully if people can extract what I'm trying to get across, some of it is infusing research into the stories. That's what my goal was, to make it credible, to make it evidence-based, yet at the same time to make it engaging, with dozens and dozens of stories. And now with the second edition just came out 2 months ago, with many, many more stories of adults whom I've known for decades. So if people could grasp onto bits of what I think I've learned, that's what it was about.
And it's interesting with the second edition coming out, thinking about all of us in the neurodiversity community and recognizing that our understanding of all types of neurodivergence has really just changed so rapidly in the last 5 to 10 years even. And I'm wondering, how has your understanding of autism changed even just since the book first came out?
Well, one of the things that I'm kind of proud of is if you look back at my doctoral dissertation in the 1970s, I truly believe that if you look at what I was looking at, it probably was one of the first studies that followed neurodiversity values decades before Judy Singer spoke about neurodiversity.
Right.
And what do I mean by that? Just to say it very quickly, I videotaped kids who were echolalic, who repeated speech, both immediate and delayed. We did a few different studies. And I said, let's not pathologize this. The literature at that time, meaningless parroting, psychotic speech, and of course, especially with Lovaas, let's extinguish it. Let's try to get rid of it, okay? And I looked at it because I'm a developmentalist by training, speech, language, communication, emotional development, and with an expertise in language development. And I said, wait a second, what I'm seeing in these kids is not what the literature is saying or what the treatment literature is trying to do. And what I said in a nutshell was that echolalia may be a part of an alternative strategy to learn language in individuals whose brains process language differently. So it was looking at it through hypothesized neurological differences in language and communication and saying, let's not pathologize it. Let's look at what it's about in the life of this evolving child or this person. And we came up with many, many different functions or purposes of echolalia, which is not only acknowledged now, even some ABA people have switched over to acknowledging that, but more than that, autistic self-advocates talk about the role that echolalia has played in their lives. And that's very validating. When any work that I do with my colleagues, when a number of autistic people say, hey, you guys are going down the right path here. Mostly, even though I work a lot with autistic people now, non-autistic people that I've worked with, we were guessing based upon literature on human development, child development. And a lot of our guesses were accurate. Such things as so-called self-stims, we've written about this for decades as being ways to self-soothe or calm or self-regulate. So all of this, of course, now is a huge part of the neurodiversity movement. I feel like we're just kind of one cog in the wheel of riding the wave of neurodiversity with other people such as, of course, Steve Silberman, who's become a good friend, with neurotribes, so many self-advocates writing about neurodiversity now. So I feel there's this wave of change that's happening.
Just going back to the echolalia for a minute, can you describe that a little bit more, maybe give some examples in case some of our audience isn't familiar with that term?
Absolutely. Echolalia, in general, just means repetition of speech. If a child repeats something immediately, so you say to a youngster, "That's a nice hat," and the youngster goes, "That's a nice hat," that's immediate echolalia. When a child or a person repeats things they've heard previously, it could be a TV commercial, it could be a conversation that mom and dad had at home the night before. Sometimes utterances or sentences that have very strong emotive content become kind of the target of echolalia. But the purposes are many. It serves many, many different functions. So for example, one function that we weren't looking at in the 70s, but now is a big issue, is emotional regulation. So if you see a youngster go into a new setting and says, "Don't worry, it's okay, everything's okay, we're going to have a fun time now," because that youngster had been told that maybe in strange settings, maybe he or she is using that to calm themselves or to reassure themselves or to regulate or to, decrease anxiety. That's just one example. You could say to a child, "You want a cookie?" And the child says, "You want a cookie, a big cookie." That would be echolalia, adding on some information to that. By the way, the term scripting is used more commonly now for what we used to call delayed echolalia. And that is repeating things in a delayed manner that have been heard previously. It could be anything from memorizing songs to a child, in his bed at night going through all the routines of the day. So many examples that I can give. But the important thing, and this is a theme of my book, Uniquely Human, is if we see a child doing something that we're not sure of, or a person doing something we're not sure of, it could be, repetitive behaviors known as stims. It could be echoing. It could be so many things. We have to ask why. We just can't say, "Oh, that looks different, therefore we need to extinguish it or get rid of it." And as a matter of fact, there's some emerging research that's saying that efforts to extinguish or minimize natural patterns of behavior of an autistic person may lead to secondary anxiety disorders. That in the long run, we tend to see people and kids on the spectrum actually be more anxious if they've gone through many years of people trying to reduce, minimize, or extinguish behavior without asking the why question. Why is this person doing this?
I think that's so key. That's like such a big part of what ends up getting missed. One of the important pieces that I feel like I use a lot when I'm supporting my autistic clients and their families really relates to some code breaking and some translating between neurotypical and neurodivergent communication styles.
Yes.
One of the key components that I see with that a lot of times is, having that communication and having that connection is really about establishing a baseline of trust. And I'm curious if you can share a little bit about how you think that trust is such an integral part of those relationships.
Yes, yeah. And, let me give credit where credit's due. I guess I've always been speaking about the importance of developing a trusting relationship with people we work with our children, with our adult friends on the spectrum. But a dear friend of mine, Michael John Carley, who's very big in the neurodiversity movement. As a matter of fact, he just got a new position, editor-in-chief of Neurodiversity Press, which is going to be, it's a brand new publisher, and it's going to be focusing on neurodiversity-oriented books. But Michael and I have been friends for many, many years, starting with when I invited him to speak at one of our conferences a number of years ago. And Michael, when we became friends, he spoke about the issue of trust. And a very famous quote from Michael is, "The opposite of anxiety isn't calm or being calm. The opposite of anxiety is trust." That if you trust people you're with, if you trust the setting that you're in, that it's not going to, be filled with all of these, what my dear friend Stephen Shore says, sensory violations. It's not going to be loud noises or things that are unpredictable. And the third thing that I talk about in Uniquely Human, I talk about trusting other people, trusting activities and settings in your life. And the third thing is trusting your body. Again, these are things we can all relate to. Many people who, for example, very unfortunately may have forms of cancer, they talk about they can't trust their body anymore because their body is attacking itself. And that's what cancer is. Or if, we go for a long hike and our knees feel kind of a little bit stressed. Oh, where's that coming from? I don't know. And we do know that people on the spectrum are more likely to have biomedical issues, food allergies, sensitivities, certainly sensory sensitivities for a subgroup of people on the spectrum, most actually. How could you trust your body if all of a sudden a noise that other people are okay with for you is painful? Or if somebody touches you, it's painful and unexpected that to be painful. So the issue of trust, I actually say in Uniquely Human that in a sense, we could think of autism as a disability of trust. Trusting the world, trusting people, trusting everyday activities, and trusting your body. And a lot of what we do in supporting people on the spectrum is helping them to develop trust in other people, helping them to be familiar with, for example, our child with the routine in school, so he or she could trust the unfolding of activities. Trusting your teacher, trusting your therapist. It's huge because when we can trust, that's when we're open for learning. Mm-hmm. When we could trust, that's when we take risks. If we cannot trust people we're with, we're not going to take risks if they say, oh, I know you don't know me all that much, but why don't you spend the afternoon with me? It's huge. And luckily, a lot of autistic friends that I have relate that to their experience, and they say it's a helpful analogy.
I agree so much. I think one of the mistakes that we make, whether we're parents or educators or therapists or whatever, is pushing our neurodivergent kids too far too fast. And because we expect them to maybe be able to do something maybe in one context, and then we expect that to generalize too quickly, or maybe we haven't given enough background knowledge or just that prepping to know, to be comfortable with what's going to happen. And I find that once that trust is broken, it's really hard to get it back.
Yes, absolutely. And that's such an important point, Emily. It's, there's a quote that I use. I do a short little presentation on trust issues, developing trust. And the quote is that trust must be earned. Too often, educators, therapists, not so much parents, but educators and therapists assume that, okay, like myself, I'm a speech language pathologist, CCC-SLP, or I'm an occupational therapist, or I'm a teacher. And automatically we assume the child should trust us.
They saw that credential, so therefore, yes, okay.
Here's your new teacher. Oh, I love you. Everything you do will be the right thing with me. No, it doesn't work that way. Mm-hmm. And trust, and you're right, when trust is broken, then you're paddling upstream. Mm-hmm. You really have to work hard to get that back. So even the most wonderful, kindest teachers and therapists, when I give workshops, I say, how many people here have ever been the primary reason that one of your students has been pushed into a meltdown? And everybody raises their hand. And I say, listen, you're not bad people. And probably the intentions were good. You wanted that youngster to sit just 5 more minutes in that classroom, okay? Or you wanted that child to wait just 3 more turns to go on the swing, okay? And the intentions are good. We want to help a child learn how to wait or to be able to process information in the classroom. But if we push that boundary too far and we don't read the child's signals that they're about to go into a meltdown, then is that child going to think, oh, this person's going to be a safety net for me, or this person will never push too far? And that might lead to that child saying when they see you, I'm not so sure about this person anymore. You're absolutely right. Mm-hmm. That when trust, and then think about this. What about when trust is violated over and over and over again? then the child develops what we refer to as negative emotional memories that become attached to that person. And again, this isn't kind of mystery autism neurodiversity stuff. We avoid people who we've had persistent negative experiences with because we know that being with that person likely will result in stress or even maybe not an overt meltdown, but certainly a lot of dysregulation.
And then what happens? The next step is that gets interpreted as defiance or bad behavior if it's not being seen, because then it's resistance or demand avoidance or whatever. And it's because there's that perceived threat, that fear and that anxiety. If we don't communicate that or understand that or give space for that, it's just really hard to ever recover from that. And so often, especially when we're talking about youth, they don't have a choice. They have to go to school. They have to be with that teacher. They have to be in that classroom. They have to be with those peers. And they have so little autonomy, which I think is also such an integral piece of that trust, like feeling like I have the ability to control my environment in some way or have some say-so over what's happening.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, again, if you look through the lens of trust, school refusal behavior, okay? The school bus pulls up or mom or dad says, okay, honey, we're about to leave for school. And the child either drops to the floor or runs into the bedroom and slams the door. We could look at that as that child, that student, that person has no trust in going back into that setting because the setting has layers of negative emotional memories of being stressed out. And we see that, I hear this all the time, I'm sure you do as well. Even for a child who's done well in the elementary years, supported well, you hit middle school with the multiple transitions, with all of, excuse the word, but all the crap that all preteens and teens are going through, where the bullying really takes off. And how could you trust a setting like that? I mean, and what do? You engage in self-protective behavior. You just say, no way am I going there. And that's kind of a big picture, but it could be the same thing with a student refusing to go into a loud, noisy cafeteria or gym. Maybe he or she likes school, but that one place, I just don't trust that place. You know, it's a sensory overload, all this random behavior. If it's not a well-organized, well-regulated lunchroom, kids are running all over the place. All the stuff that people on the spectrum and kids on the spectrum have difficulty with.
What are some ways that we can work to share that control? How can we give that sense of control to help build that trust?
Well, I think, first of all, this is not new news to many of your listeners. We've been talking about this since my first autism class that I taught in 1979, and that is the importance of predictability. Kids and people on the spectrum don't like surprises. You know, they don't want things to unfold suddenly in front of them, especially if it's something that might be a little challenging or difficult to understand. So the more we make things predictable, the more we give a person or kids maps that they know what's going to happen. So let me tell you a quick story. I'm involved in helping, or have been, in helping to set up a expressive arts and theater program based upon the Miracle Project in Los Angeles, which is an expressive arts and theater program that's evidence-based. And the founder, Elaine Hall, is a very dear friend. So we, for the last 5 years, been doing that at Brown University and in the Providence area. So we had our camp. We have after school programs. That was all Zoom the last few years, but we had our live camp just 2 weeks ago. And there's a young man I know, I've known him since he was probably 6 and he's around 30 now. And just a wonderful spirit and talented artist, bright young man, but he really needs predictability. And because this was a whole new schedule, every morning he came in and said, okay, Barry, what are we doing first? And I say, well, you know, we just have settle-in time, we draw. And then what? You know, and once we wrote things down, you know, any good school program has the visual calendars and schedules and all of that, but this was kind of a camp situation. It was a little bit different. But once he had internalized that he knew what was coming and it was all right with him, that was important. But it doesn't mean that this young man, his name is Patrick, that this young man must fully engage in every activity. If he says, oh, I need a break, or I'd rather do this. It's camp. Camp's supposed to be fun. So, yeah, we had a sensory room off of the gym as part of the camp. So some kids took sensory breaks and maybe joined the activity afterwards. Or and this really did not happen, I think it happened maybe once with one student, one camper. He was having a particularly tough day. So he spent more time in the sensory room and joined us when he felt okay. So that's another thing. Not having situations imposed upon you when you're feeling confused, especially when you're feeling confused or dysregulated. Literally, as you say, offering choices. So I know kids whose parents switched from giving them clothes in the morning to get dressed into to giving them choices of what clothes they would wear. It's not open-ended. It's not like, oh, what pants do you want to wear today? It might be, oh, well, let's see. We have 3 different types of pants you could wear today. What do you want? Having a sense of control is one of the best ways to help build a trusting relationship if we offer that. I like to call it predictable control within structure. Fine. I mean, if a person or a child on the spectrum can deal with open-endedness, where you might say, oh, we just have a free couple of hours. What do you want to do? That's fine. But we find in most cases offering choices is a better way to go.
What are some of the misconceptions that you feel like still persist that you would really like to break down?
Oh, my goodness. We are all on that journey, aren't we?
Yes.
Okay, let's start with some of the important ones. That autistic people and children are not interested in having loving, trusting relationships with other people. They're very, very interested. But there are more barriers in their life and more barriers due to their neurology in making that as easy as it is for many other people. And of course, people not on the autism spectrum may have some of those same challenges, but not as persistent, not as severe. So, for example, we're likely to be okay with a person who speaks loudly and maybe touches us, and we kind of say, well, don't touch me. But for a child or a person on the spectrum, that might be so off-putting that I don't want to be with that person, even though I'm kind of interested in that person. Mm-hmm. So that's just one example. A big one now that a lot of people talk about is that autistic people don't have empathy, that they don't have any kind of sense of what another person is feeling, being able to kind of be in their emotional shoes. They may not be able to fully articulate that, or their empathic reaction might be a little less conventional. So I hear all the time, for example, from parents about their child who's autistic, who's thought of as, okay, not interested in people that much, not empathic, but a grandparent is living in the home and is ill and is dying, and the child goes over every morning and sits and holds their hand. Mm-hmm. Just all the classic signs of showing a caring reaction to another person. One of the greatest myths that I really hit on strongly and uniquely human is the myth of autistic behaviors. That autistic people do all these things that nobody else ever does. Stimming falls into that category, echoing speech, persistent avoidant behavior. And the argument that I make in Uniquely Human, with very specific examples, even from typical kids and from us, is that there's no such thing as autistic behaviors. These are all human behaviors and human reactions. And by saying, oh, that's just an autistic behavior, that's stimming and that rocking, or that's staring at his fingers, or running in circles, or whatever it might be, or the echoing. Once we say it's an autistic behavior, that's one step towards pathologizing it. And many of your listeners are probably too young to remember, but in the 60s and 70s and even a bit into the 80s, when behaviors were pathologized, it allowed researchers to do all kinds of awful things for behavioral patterns that really were, in some cases, of no great consequence. So how do you stop a child from rocking? How do you stop a child from staring their fingers? People in the early days were using shock to stop that, okay? Or maybe less directly painful, but certainly possibly traumatic, whole series of studies with aversive stimuli, like put a child in a room And if a child starts rocking in his chair, you shut the lights off and leave the child in the total dark. Okay? My point is that once you start saying and othering autistic people and othering the behavior, othering meaning that, oh, only they do it, nobody else does it, it's pathologized, it gives you a lot of permission. Now let's talk about what's happening now still, okay? A child is having a difficult time, maybe a meltdown for some reason. It could be he's feeling pain or loud, unexpected noise, falls to the ground and starts screaming, okay? A very popular approach to any undesirable behavior is planned ignoring, which means you have a plan. When you see that behavior, you turn away, you give no attention, you ignore it. The justification comes from very traditional behavioral notion that for operant conditioning, oh, if you give that child attention, you're just going to reinforce that bad behavior and the child will do it more often. Would we ever ignore a child who's highly dysregulated, who's not on the spectrum, who's having a meltdown due to circumstances beyond their control? And that's where the whole notion of relationship-based approaches come in. And that could be anything from our model, the CERTS model, the DIR model based upon Greenspan's work, where no, it is our job to be compassionate, responsive people to help children or adults on the spectrum not see the world as one that's either scary or where people cannot help me out in any way. How is a child to know that this person can be of assistance and I could trust this person if we ignore them when they're going through this terrible situation and they're in a panic in some cases?
It goes back to that trust.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we do still see reactions in some approaches, or what people are trained to do in some approaches, that still have those residuals of looking at behavior through the lens of pathology.
Well, this has been just an amazing conversation. As we wrap up, I have one last question for you.
Sure.
If you were talking to a parent who had a newly diagnosed autistic child, what words of advice or hope would you give to them?
Number one, I would say this child's potential is unlimited. That even as a professional, I started out as a teenager working in summer camps. I've more than 50 years in the field. I am still amazed when I reconnect with kids I knew when they were very young, doing things that nobody ever expected they would do. Anything from art, music, academic achievement, employment. I have the privilege of having that long lens and also living in the same area for 35 years. So I know many, many families whose kids I knew as preschoolers who are now in their 30s. And it's just unbelievable. As so many parents say, well, my daughter, Erica, proved them wrong again. It's like with all those dire prognostic indicators, that still unfortunately happens, less so than in the past, but that's one thing. The other thing I would say is get your kids out into the world with the right supports, of course. But there's a world full of wonderful things that in some cases might be challenging for the child. It might be challenging for the family, like going to a noisy amusement park. But if we take it one step at a time, that's how kids find what they love in the world. And that's how they learn to cope in situations that might be somewhat confusing or a little off-putting initially. I could tell you lots of stories of parents who've gotten back to me. Uniquely Human, the first edition came out 7 years ago, and parents who write to me and say, I really took that to heart, get my kid out in the world, and things we thought he would never be comfortable doing, he asks for now, And I think the final thing is, trust your instincts in a few ways. Trust your instincts about your child, but trust your instincts about the professionals and the people you're bringing into the family's life who are there to support you and your child. Don't put up with a professional who you feel is not getting your child, who is off-putting to you, is not respectful of you as a parent, who is big issue, who is violating your intuitions as to what is best. I'm not saying don't trust professionals. I'm saying just be very selective as to what feels like a connection that's working for you and your child, whether your child is an adult or a youngster. I think those are the major things I would emphasize.
Barry, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure, Emily. Great discussion and great questions, so thank you.
Just because someone acts differently or uses different ways to communicate or doesn't follow all of the invisible social rules that somehow society has deemed important doesn't mean their way of being human is wrong or broken. Taking the time to listen and understand each individual is key. Validating all human experiences empowers people to live their authentic lives. When we embrace these differences, this diversity, rather than trying to change them, we create a better world for everyone. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thanks again to Barry Prizant. We have links to his book and website on the episode page at neurodiversitypodcast.com. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our social media and production assistant is Krista Brown. The executive producer and studio editor is me, Dave Morris. For everyone here, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. This is a production of the Neurodiversity Alliance.